When you hear a description like the one you just heard, a president convicted by the Senate refusing to leave, federal marshals and Secret Service agents entering the Oval Office at 3:47 in the morning to escort him out, the first reaction for many people is shock, maybe even a kind of morbid fascination. It feels cinematic. It feels like a scene from a political thriller, not the ordinary functioning of what we have been taught is the world's oldest continuous democracy. But I want to invite you to hear this story in a very different way, not as a dramatic exception, not as a freak event, but as a revealing moment in the normal life of a system whose cracks, contradictions, and accumulated tensions finally became impossible to hide. When a political crisis reaches the point that federal law enforcement has to physically remove a head of state from the seat of power, that did not begin at 3:47 a.m. in the Oval Office. That began decades earlier in the way we organized our economy, in the way we distributed power, in the way we allowed wealth to accumulate and to translate itself into political dominance. By the time a marshal says, "Sir, you are no longer the president. The Senate has removed you. The underlying system has already failed in multiple ways." What you're seeing is not the failure itself. You're seeing the emergency repair. Think carefully about the sequence laid out in that timeline. At 6:23 p.m., marshals arrive and are stopped by Secret Service agents still loyal to the president. At 8:47 p.m., the director of the Secret Service has to come in personally and say, "Our oath is not to an individual, our oath is to the Constitution." Agents peel away over the course of the night. 3 at 9:34 p.m., 2 more at 10:15 p.m., until only 7 remain. By 1:47 a.m., the director confronts the remaining holdouts and forces a choice: stand down, facilitate the lawful order, or resign and face consequences. At 2:34 a.m., the last resistance collapses. At 3 a.m., the plan is finalized. At 3:47 a.m., the agents and marshals enter, and at 4:03 a.m., the former president is escorted out. I want you to notice that what is being celebrated here is not democracy in its ordinary, healthy functioning. What is being celebrated is the fact that the system was, at the very last possible moment, able to enforce its own rules against a leader who refused to accept them. We must not confuse the successful use of an emergency brake with a train that is running properly. When a train is hurtling toward a cliff and at 3:47 in the morning, someone finally pulls the emergency brake and the train screeches to a halt inches before disaster, you can applaud the brake. But you should not congratulate the people who designed the train or the track. For a Marxian economist like me, this moment is a textbook illustration of what we mean by a crisis of legitimacy. The president in that Oval Office insists, "I am the president. I was elected by the American people. You do not have the authority to remove me." Notice the argument. It is not legal, it is populist. It is an appeal to something above and beyond the institutional framework, the will of the people as he claims to embody it. And the marshal replies correctly that the Constitution vests the Senate with the power to convict and remove. Legally, the marshal is right. But socially, historically, that conflict between "I embody the people and these are the rules" is exactly the conflict you get when a system's economic foundations have created such deep divisions, such bitter resentments, that large segments of the population no longer trust the institutions that claim to speak in their name. When we organize society around a capitalist economy that systematically enriches a tiny minority, that hollows out the middle, that abandons whole regions and communities to decay, we are building the preconditions for a president to say, "I am the real people, the institutions are the enemy," and for millions to nod their heads. I want to be very clear on this point. The constitutional procedures, the impeachment, the Senate trial, the vote to convict, and finally the physical removal are the surface of the story, not its core. The core is that for decades we have been living in an economic system in which a small group of major shareholders, corporate boards of directors, and financial institutions have been accumulating extraordinary power. They have used that power to rewrite tax codes, to deregulate industries, to weaken unions, to privatize public services, to globalize production in ways that devastated working class communities in the United States. They have turned politics into a marketplace in which candidates are brands, campaigns are marketing operations, and elections are auctions in which the highest bidders, the biggest donors, get the most influence. Under those conditions, it is almost inevitable that sooner or later a figure would emerge who explicitly rejects the constraints of institutions, who offers himself as the strong man who will finally take on the establishment and who, when cornered, refuses to accept defeat. The particular personality, the specific scandals, the details of the Senate trial, those are variable. The underlying engine driving this conflict is the way capitalism concentrates economic power and then translates that power into political crisis. Look at the actors involved in this moment. You have the Secret Service agents who initially blocked the marshals. Why? Because they see their job as protecting the president as a person, not safeguarding an abstract constitutional order. You have a director who has to remind them late in the evening that their real oath is not to an individual but to the Constitution. You have agents who peel away, some sooner, some later, in a kind of moral and institutional sorting process. This is a scene that plays out in many historical moments when an existing power structure is shaken. The security forces, the bureaucrats, the legal apparatus, all forced to decide whether to remain loyal to a person, a regime, or a set of rules. Marxists have long studied such moments in revolutions, in coups, in crises, because they reveal clearly something that is usually hidden, that the state is not a neutral arbiter floating above society. It is an apparatus staffed by people with their own careers, loyalties, and material interests, operating within an economic structure dominated by employers, owners, and creditors. What looks like a purely constitutional moment is also a workplace moment. Secret Service agents are workers. The director is their boss. She reminds them that they can be fired, disciplined, even prosecuted. This is, at one level, a labor management dispute about obedience with guns. The scene in the Oval Office is especially instructive. The former president sits at the Resolute desk reviewing documents. He is not barricading the doors. He is not brandishing a weapon. He is performing the role of a working president, reading, deciding, governing, even after the legal basis for that role has evaporated. When the marshal tells him he has been removed, he responds that this is unlawful, that the agents do not have the authority to remove him. At that moment, we have two competing claims to authority: the authority of formal written rules and the authority of power as it has been actually lived and experienced by this individual. For years, perhaps for decades, this man has lived in a world where wealth, status, and media presence allowed him to bend rules, to evade accountability, to treat institutions as obstacles to be outmaneuvered, not constraints to be humbly accepted. That is not an accident. It is how capitalism socializes its elites. If you are a major CEO, if you run a large hedge fund, if you own a media empire, you are accustomed to people doing what you say. You are accustomed to bending regulators, courts, legislatures to your will. So when such a person becomes president, are we surprised that he experiences removal as an affront, as illegitimate, as something to be resisted? I also want to highlight the repeated appeals in the narration to press the like button, subscribe, turn on notifications, and so on. On the surface, those are simply the familiar rituals of social media, the way content creators try to game the algorithm and build an audience. But look more closely. Here we have a narration of a constitutional crisis, of a president being physically removed from the seat of power in the middle of the night, and woven into that narration are explicit appeals to an algorithm owned and controlled by a gigantic private corporation. Whether this video, this analysis, this interpretation of events becomes visible to millions or is buried in obscurity depends not on some public democratic process, not on an open civic forum, but on the opaque decisions of a profit-maximizing platform and its recommendation system. That is itself a profound commentary on where we are. Even the way we process, understand, and talk about the breakdown of political authority is mediated by privately owned platforms whose real loyalty is not to democracy, not to the Constitution, but to shareholder value. So when the narrator tells the audience, the algorithm determines what gains visibility, you decide whether this analysis reaches those who need to see it. I hear very clearly the deeper reality. No, you don't fully decide. The platform decides. Your individual choice to click, to like, to share operates within a structure that has already been designed to maximize engagement, advertising revenue, and profit. In other words, the same logic that has hollowed out working class communities, the same logic that has turned elections into multi-billion-dollar spectacles shaped by corporate donors, is also shaping the very flow of information about this spectacular constitutional crisis. Capitalism is not just an economic system that produces goods and services. It is also a system that owns and controls the channels through which we interpret and respond to events like a president refusing to leave office. Let us step back and ask a basic question. How does a society get to the point where a president refuses to leave even after all legal avenues are exhausted? One popular explanation is to focus on the individual, his personality, his narcissism, his authoritarian tendencies, his psychological profile. Another explanation focuses on polarization, partisan media, culture wars, social media bubbles, and so on. These factors matter, but I submit to you that they are not the root. The root lies in the long-term evolution of American capitalism, especially since the 1970s, as real wages stagnated for the majority, as unions were crushed, as jobs were relocated overseas, as public services were cut back, as student debt exploded, as housing costs soared. Millions of people experienced a steady erosion of their economic security and dignity. At the same time, they were told over and over that this was the best system humanity had ever created, that any problems were temporary, that with enough hard work and personal responsibility, they too could rise. That contradiction between lived experience and ideology produces rage, frustration, and a desperate search for explanations. Who steps into that vacuum? Very often, it is demagogues who are themselves creatures of the very economic elite that created the problem, but who present themselves as the outsiders, the truth tellers, the enemies of the establishment. They channel legitimate anger at economic decline into attacks on scapegoats, immigrants, minorities, foreign countries, globalists, and of course the dreaded elites, by which conveniently they almost never mean the capitalist class itself. Instead, the elites become professors, journalists, bureaucrats, cultural figures, anyone who might challenge the narrative. When such a figure gains the presidency, he becomes, for his supporters, not just a politician, but a symbol, a last stand against a system they feel has betrayed them. Under those conditions, the idea that this figure could be removed by the same institutions they already distrust, a Senate they see as corrupted, a judiciary they see as politicized, media they see as hostile, becomes almost unthinkable. So when it happens, when those institutions finally do act, a significant portion of the public simply refuses to accept it. The president's refusal to leave is, in that sense, the personalized expression of a much broader loss of faith. Consider, too, the role of the Senate in this story. The Constitution grants the Senate the power to try and convict a president. But who are the senators? They are, in overwhelming numbers, individuals whose campaigns were financed by wealthy donors, corporations, and political action committees. They are people who spend a large portion of their time fundraising from those donors. They operate in a political system whose permissible range of debate is already narrowed by the influence of money. For such a body to reach the point of convicting and removing a president of its own system is extraordinary. It suggests that the president, in his aggression, in his refusal to play by even the minimal rules of the club, had become a liability to the smooth functioning of the larger system of power. In other words, when a president becomes too destabilizing, when his attacks on institutions threaten the basic stability that capitalism requires to reproduce itself, the system may discipline him. Not because it has suddenly become virtuous, not because it suddenly cares about democracy in some abstract sense, but because the costs of keeping him in place outweigh the benefits. Think of this as an intra-elite conflict, a conflict among different factions of the ruling class and their political representatives. Some were perfectly happy to use this president when he cut their taxes, when he deregulated their industries, when he appointed judges favorable to business. But when his behavior began to endanger the credibility of the very institutions that legitimized their dominance, some of them turned against him. The Senate conviction is the visible expression of that turn. The 3:47 a.m. entrance of the marshals is its enforcement arm. Meanwhile, millions of ordinary people struggling with low wages, precarious jobs, unaffordable health care watch this drama unfold on their screens, urged to press like and subscribe, as if the primary arena of their political agency were a set of buttons under a video rather than the workplaces where they produce society's wealth. I also want us to look at the way the narrative emphasizes that democracy endured its most critical test. That is a very telling formulation. If democracy is reduced to the question, will the security services obey the Constitution and escort this man out? Then yes, you can say democracy passed a test. But that is a very thin procedural understanding of democracy. From a Marxian perspective, real democracy requires that the people who are affected by decisions have meaningful control over those decisions. That means democracy in the workplace, where we spend most of our waking lives. It means workers collectively directing enterprises, not a tiny group of owners and executives. It means social control over investment decisions, over what we produce, how we produce it, for whom. None of that exists in our current system. Our democracy is largely confined to choosing every few years among candidates pre-selected and pre-filtered by a system of campaign finance that serves the interests of capital. Under those conditions, to claim that a midnight removal of a recalcitrant president proves the health of democracy is frankly an evasion. In fact, I would argue that the very need to stage this kind of dramatic enforcement action is proof that democracy is fragile, that its foundations are eroding. A healthy democratic society would have robust, trusted institutions that could remove a leader peacefully with broad public acceptance, because those institutions would be seen as genuinely representing the population, not particular economic interests. But when you have decades of neoliberal policies, privatization, austerity, deregulation, that have systematically weakened public institutions and strengthened private power, you create exactly the opposite conditions. Trust collapses, conspiracy theories flourish. Each decision by Congress or the courts is seen by many not as the outcome of a fair process, but as the maneuver of one faction of a corrupt elite. In that context, the only thing that could finally end the crisis is the sight of armed agents escorting the leader out. That is not a triumph of democracy. It is a symptom of its crisis. Return for a moment to the agents themselves. The narrative tells us that by midnight, only 7 remained with the former president, and those 7 were uncertain. This is the language of moral and institutional ambiguity. They are torn between loyalty to the man they have protected, perhaps for years, and loyalty to an abstract system. They are also, let us not forget, torn between the material consequences of disobeying a direct order from their director and the emotional pull of their previous role. This is a small-scale picture of something all workers confront in a capitalist system. How many times has a worker faced a choice between obeying a boss's directive that conflicts with their sense of justice or solidarity and risking their livelihood by refusing? For most workers, the risk of disobedience is too great. They have rent to pay, children to feed, health care to maintain. They comply, often unhappily. The Secret Service agents, too, are employees. Their director is, in effect, their employer. When she makes plain that disobedience means dismissal and possible prosecution, the last holdouts stand down. What is framed as a noble reaffirmation of constitutional duty is also, at a very real level, the enforcement of workplace discipline within a hierarchical organization. In that sense, the entire episode can be seen as a condensed drama of capitalist power relations. At the top, contending elites, the president versus the Senate, factions of capital for and against him, struggle over control of the state. In the middle, senior officials like the Secret Service director and the FBI supervisor translate those elite decisions into operational plans, making sure that the apparatus does not fracture in the process. At the bottom, rank-and-file agents and marshals carry out orders with little say over the larger stakes. Meanwhile, the public is mostly a spectator, watching through screens, invited to participate symbolically through clicks and shares. This is not a democratic structure. It is a command structure wrapped in democratic language. What then is the problem that this story reveals? It is not simply that we had a bad president, or that the institutions were slow to act, or that partisanship has gone too far. The deeper problem is that we have allowed an economic system based on private profit, on the undemocratic control of workplaces by a minority, to shape our politics, our media, and even our imaginations. We have normalized the idea that massive corporations should own and operate the platforms on which we communicate, that billionaires should finance and effectively select our political leaders, that unelected central bankers and corporate executives should decide the direction of our economy. In such a world, the idea that the people truly rule is already a fiction long before a president locks himself in the Oval Office and refuses to leave. The late night standoff is only the most visible theatrical expression of a democracy that has been hollowed out from within by capitalism. If we want to understand what really happened in those 12 hours between the Senate conviction and the 4:03 a.m. departure, we must widen our lens. We must see that confrontation not just as a test of legal procedures, but as the collision of two legitimacies rooted in a broader economic order, the legitimacy of formal institutions designed, funded, and influenced by capital, and the insurgent, personalized legitimacy of a leader who claims to speak directly for a people battered by that same economic order. The agents in the hallway, the director on the phone, the marshals at the gate, they are all actors in a play whose script was written over decades of neoliberal restructuring, deindustrialization, rising inequality, and political disillusionment. To focus only on the final scene, to tell ourselves that because the right door opened at 3:47 a.m. and the right convoy rolled out at 4:03 a.m., everything is fundamentally fine, is to miss the lesson that history is trying to teach us. So, where does this leave us? The corporate media will play that footage of the helicopter leaving at 4:03 a.m. on a loop and tell you, see, the system worked, the Constitution held. But I am telling you, this is a dangerous illusion. The deep structural conditions that produce this crisis, the stagnation of real wages, the grotesque concentration of wealth, the profound alienation of the working class remain completely untouched. The same boardrooms still decide our economic fate. The same donors still buy our politicians. Removing one individual from one office does not remove the rot at the foundation. If we truly want to prevent this from happening again, we cannot simply tweak the political rules or celebrate the Secret Service. We must go to the root. We must bring democracy to where it matters most, the workplace. We need a system where workers, not absentee shareholders, make the decisions, where the surplus value we produce is used to enrich our communities, not to buy elections. Until we democratize the economy, until we end the tyranny of the minority in our workplaces, our political democracy will remain fragile, hollow, and vulnerable to the next demagogue who promises to burn it all down. The choice is not between this president and the status quo. The choice is between barbarism and a genuine socialism for the 21st century.